Welcome back, Veiled Seekers. Welcome back to the Veiled Path podcast. I am your host. I am Froylan. It's good to see you guys again. Welcome back. On today's episode, I want to continue down this trajectory of new thought and how it relates to both magic and the occult. One pioneer from the 20th century was a man who was not born here, but in fact born in Barbados, and immigrated to the United States to live as an actor before eventually pivoting into mind metaphysics and introducing the world to his method through writing and preaching. A man who spent years studying esotericism and seeking the mysteries of life, only to realize that the power he had to create the life that he wanted was within his grasp the whole time. From the stage to Rosicrucian disciple, to the pulpit, preaching his method of imagination and manifestation. This is the life of Neville Goddard, and this is the Veiled Path podcast. On our last episode, we discussed the beginnings of the New Thought movement in the United States. We touched on the thinking of minds like Ralph Waldo Emerson, Phineas Quimby, Emma Curtis Hopkins, and more particularly, William Walker Atkinson. There existed another thinker in New Thought after Walker's time that added a more romantic element to realizing and manifesting our deepest desires. As the methods of New Thought were refined over the years, such as coming down from Phineas Quimby and his application of mesmerism and applying those methods to improve health and well-being, to subsequent writers applying mind metaphysics to other areas such as business and spirituality, it was the writings of Neville Goddard who really simplified the method and spread the message of his process through his books and his preaching. Now, before we get into his process, his method for this manifestation and improving your life, first I want to get into a little bit about his life. Neville Goddard was born in 1905 in St. Michael, Barbados. The fourth of 10 children, Neville's father was a successful commercial businessman who owned a network of grocery stores that operated around Barbados. Subsequently, his family lived comfortably, and he was proud of his father and his brother successfully managing such a wide business and helping the family remain successful. That being said, as much as Neville actually admired his father and eldest brother for running the business, he knew that it was not his life goal to be a businessman. Neville had some other things in mind. Neville was a more spiritually inclined youth and drawn to the arts rather than to business. At the young age of 17, Neville decided to immigrate to the United States on his own and ended up in New York City. Within 3 years of his life in New York City, he made it to the stage, regularly working as a vaudeville and later Broadway stage performer and dancer. And he was really good at it too. There were newspapers, critics who wrote about him. He was even compared to being a young Rudolph Valentino in his day and age. I guess that was the compliment of the day. His work dancing was so incredibly successful that he actually took the show on the road throughout Europe. Thus, Neville got to travel. He got to travel to London, to Berlin, and to Paris. Now, it just so happened to be that this business in Europe is actually what triggered Neville to study mysticism a lot more. While on tour, he encountered a Scotsman whom he had a conversation with, who discussed latest research of mediumship and psychic phenomena. Around that time, Neville actually got to participate in a seance ceremony, and it had a profound impact on him from that point. Now, following this tour, we find ourselves in the year 1929. What do we know that happened in the year 1929? Of course, the stock market crashed. The Great Depression hit everybody really hard, and it was a troubling time for Neville during his performance days. Not many people had money to spare, therefore tickets were not being sold to these dance performances. And it's around this time that Neville then began to fall into despair and feel scared for his future in New York City. Keep in mind, it's a grim time on the entire planet. The entire world went through a shake during this period. So it was a great time of despair. And it's the fact that Neville lived through this that he is constantly going to come back to this period to emphasize his later point. We'll get to that. Alas, Neville, like everybody, fell into despair. So, at that point, he began to wonder what was going to happen to his future in the dance halls. So, like any normal person, he turned to spirituality when he started to feel hopeless. Neville had begun studying esotericism. He had dabbled in the occult, and he was therefore on the search for a rigid form of spirituality that he could dedicate his life to. One prominent step that Neville took to further his spiritual understandings was when he joined a fellowship of Rosicrucians. He had dedicated himself completely to this system. He worked up the grades. He amended his life and was now going to be living a more austere lifestyle as compared to what came before that. Small side note for anybody that doesn't know what Rosicrucianism is, we've touched on it in other episodes, but essentially Rosicrucianism is a movement that explores esoteric aspects and combines it with Christianity. The movements and the groups that have formed in the name of Rosicrucianism formed based off the existence of 3 documents that came down from the Renaissance period. They are mythologically ascribed to a man named Christian Rosenkreutz, who then submitted this message as the main testimony for which to base the philosophy of Rosicrucianism on. Essentially, it is a esoteric branch of Christian beliefs. We can leave it at that for now. Now, Neville's time studying Rosicrucianism was fruitful, but it was also very stressful. As I said, now he was living a more severe and austere lifestyle. During this period, he became a devoted vegetarian and lived a life of sexual celibacy. It's at this time that Neville would later comment that he seemed to be attracted and focused completely on the outer forms of religion and not so much the underlying spiritual reality that permeates it. Several years later, in the early 1930s, Neville was about to have his next spiritual pivot and ultimate breakthrough into what came next. It was the year 1931 that, by Neville's own account, he was introduced to who was to become his greatest teacher. The man's name was Abdullah. Now again, all from Neville's own account, Abdullah was a black Jewish rabbi who gained Neville's spiritual attention, and from that point on, he dedicated himself to the teachings and followed Abdullah as a disciple. Their first meeting got off to a weird start when he introduced himself to Abdullah, and Abdullah said, "Neville, you are 6 months too late." When Neville came back and was asking, "Wait, have we met before? I don't understand." Abdullah replied, "No, the brothers have told me that you were going to come to me, and that was 6 months ago, so you're late." Despite this fact, Neville was immediately captivated by this man. What this man had to provide as a spiritual elder, Neville wanted it. After this, Neville dedicated the next 5 years of his life to studying under Abdullah and learning his secrets. One more interesting side note is that some people since the time of Neville Goddard have made the claim that perhaps he made up Abdullah just as some sort of foreign mystical teacher that miraculously appears when Neville most needed it, so that then he could teach his methods and those methods could seem a little more credible. That being said, we really have no reason to think that Neville would have done such a thing. Everything that Neville has testified in his books about himself have actually been corroborated by other people, even today in the modern day, who want to find out if Neville was at all fibbing in his testimony. Recently, though, the occult historian Mitch Horowitz presented an interesting theory, which I felt was compelling. Horowitz proposes that the black Jewish rabbi who taught Neville was actually potentially the black Israelite or black Hebrew musician Arnold Josiah Ford. Now, Ford lived in New York during this time, at the same time Neville was performing in New York as well. Considering one worked as a musician and the other worked in dance, it stands to reason that these two would have actually connected through a common network. One other small detail to back this up is that by Neville's own account, Abdullah would wear a turban, and there is photographic evidence of Ford going around at times wearing a turban. Personally, I don't care. A lot of people can make up their own mythology to give their teaching credibility, but I think Neville's teaching stands for itself, so we need not exhaust this point. We can move on from it. Back to Neville's story. In late 1933, Neville received a letter from his brother who was writing Neville about some unfortunate events back in Barbados. Neville recognized that he hadn't seen his family for 12 years, so he was sad to receive this letter from his brother expressing that things aren't going so well. He missed his family, so he wished he could go home for Christmas to Barbados to see his family. At this time, he began to despair. He began to feel like there's no way for me to get that money. Times are tough. No one can even loan me that money, so where am I going to get it? He then turned to Abdullah and began venting to his teacher that he did not see a way he was going to be able to travel back home for Christmas. Abdullah did not disappoint. Abdullah admonished Neville, indeed letting him know that a way was going to be provided for him to go back to Barbados for Christmas. What he instructed was for Neville to actually visualize being back home in Barbados. Something so simple, yet not quite. Neville didn't know what he meant by that specifically, so he would take long walks by the beach where he would actually picture that he was home walking at the beach of Barbados. He began to see buildings and palm trees differently as if they were from home. He did this fairly often, but he didn't know what the point of this was, so he kept bugging his teacher to give him the reason or maybe a deeper secret because this didn't seem like it was going to work. He would bug Abdullah so much that one particular time Abdullah slammed the door in his face, and before he did so, he said, "Neville, I can't even hear you. You are in Barbados. You're not talking to me." Something about that, though, sparked something in Neville's mind that perhaps instead of merely just visualizing being on Barbados, no, he wanted the ultimate reality of Barbados. So he should now project the end goal of being in Barbados and begin to witness that starting in his mind and move out. So he beefed up his practice just a little more and was really starting to lose hope because December rolled around until finally he did receive a letter from his brother with money inside saying the family did want him home, so they were sending money on ahead and they wished to see him this Christmas. Based off this event, Neville was now fully convinced that what he had done was he had assumed the end state. And then he stopped doubting that the process was going to work. His teacher assured him it was going to work, so he trusted. So this was a turning point for Neville. He had essentially experienced what we would call a miracle. This is what Abdullah conveyed to Neville. Abdullah had taught him that this was a secret of the universe and that it was humans who had been speaking mystically about it ever since. Now it was following this period that Neville began to feel like he wanted to commit to teaching people this method and help people improve their own lives. It is after this 5-year period that Neville began speaking publicly about mind metaphysics and became a type of charismatic preacher. So while the economy was hurting, Neville saw the opportunity after studying. He could leave the stage as a dancer, but return to the stage as a preacher of hope. In 1941, Neville wrote his first book called At Your Command. It is here that Neville uses the biblical name of Yahweh, YHVH, or translated to I am. I am that I am. This is the Tetragrammaton. This is the ultimate secret name in Judaism for the divine, and its ultimate meaning is I am, or I am that I am. Neville taught in this book that this name is the ultimate metaphysical reality that is meant to be exercised by all people, not something distant or cut off from reality. I am represents your true state of being, and what you allow your state to be is the ultimate reality that you are going to find yourself in. For example, Neville's transition of visualizing I want to be in Barbados to I am in Barbados. That is when he saw the results of what he was visualizing. And it was after this that Neville slowly began to continue on as both a writer and a speaker. In the year 1941, the United States entered World War II. It was at this time that Neville was actually drafted into the armed forces to go serve in Europe and fight against Hitler, thus being forced to leave the business that he had started. It was this situation where Neville was actually going to now exercise Abdullah's method for a second big time. Neville truly felt like his calling was to teach this method to other people and to continue his work here. There was a problem. When you're drafted, you can't just say no. So he began to use the method that he would receive an honorable discharge, however that may happen, but he would trust that it was going to happen. So he began visualizing receiving the papers of honorable discharge. It apparently paid off. 1943, he's told he is being honorably discharged and he can return back to New York. We don't actually know the reason for the discharge today. And again, some people have raised this as a speculation that perhaps he found some way to actually be excused. It didn't just happen because of the method. Once again, Mitch Horowitz did some background checking, looked into the Army files, and indeed, according to Horowitz, he was released simply by honorable discharge. Now, this episode really sealed the deal for him on this method. If there was any doubt in his mind that this was a method that was going to actually work, the guy had his assurance. Now, following this, Neville's books began to come out in a very quick succession, one after the other. He began speaking more, particularly between both Los Angeles and New York City. Now, it's after this period of talks and books that Neville has spent time on the method. It has been laid out concisely. First, know what you desire. Might sound like common sense. Second, construct an imaginary experience that implies that the desire has already been fulfilled. Third, enter a deeply relaxed state. As you continue visualizing, experience the scene from the first person. Feel its reality, persist in the assumption, and don't obsess over how it's going to happen. In fact, he cautions against laying out the method you are going to receive it. He stipulates that that should just be left as a mystery. Just be in the end state, and now from there, witness it, project it out. Now, this became Neville's method for years to follow, but it was the year 1959 that Neville claimed that he had a mystical experience that caused him to take a step further in the method and now put the method in a larger context. In his book, writing up this experience that he had called The Law and the Promise, he begins to see the method more mystically. One thing particularly about Neville, especially by this point, is that by now he is using the Bible primarily as a mystical manual for this method. He takes stories from the Bible and interprets them in a mystical fashion where it's a reality that is occurring or some magical teaching. And from there, he can now convey the message as it correlates between scripture and the individual. He uses that as a method. Continuing that vein that he had started earlier, expressing in the name of God man's ultimate existential reality. God's most deepest and highest name is I am, or I am that I am. God is God because he is the fundamental reality of being that can only be expressed in the short statement, I am. Humanity has had this same fundamental awareness tied to our consciousness from the beginning. This reality in humanity is the part of humanity that is connected to the divine. It is the reality that manifests and creates for everyone. He elaborates more that imagination is a connection between mankind and God's creative magic. As you imagine a reality that you desire and assume it to be the present reality, you are exercising that divine creative principle. Because that's in our nature, that's who we are as humans, that shows that we are made in the image of God. And it's as God creates that we as humans desire to create. It is in our fundamental nature. Now, this seems revolutionary for Neville to be making these connections. These connections had already been made ages prior to Neville, but we're now in a period where through writing and the advancement of media as it had been by that time, he was now getting this message out to the masses. Now people in the mainstream could hear these connections for the first time. This is why people were so attracted to Neville, because he eloquently spoke and wrote these things down in a way that captivated his audience. He made them truly believe and feel what he had experienced. One more technique that I found interesting that Neville spent time writing about was through his SATS meditation. Now, SATS, S-A-T-S, is an acronym for state akin to sleep. Neville rightly points out that for every spiritual practice, whether it's yoga, meditation, or even magic, The practitioner must be able to achieve as much relaxed state as possible for their operation to have the most benefit and the best results. Neville found that when you relax before you go to sleep, you're creating the perfect conditions to allow the imagination to perform this type of creative magic. Neville, by his own admission, admitted that out of all the drugs and substances out there, he just seemed too attracted to alcohol. Again, by his own admission, every day for lunch, he consumed a bottle of alcohol and would take a really long nap after his lunch every day. It was in this period prior to falling asleep that he would exercise this SATS form of meditation and try to subliminate the visualization process into his subconscious. There is this relationship between sleep and the subconscious. We might think of the dreams that we are experiencing while we're asleep are coming up from our subconscious. So conceivably, that period of falling asleep is the time where you're going to have the closest direct access to an opening subconscious. So if your last thought being the visualization that you're experiencing, you're quickly submerging this into the subconscious for it now to come back up and out and manifest in reality. Again, very mystical stuff, but also practical. This was something Neville truly thought was working. He believed that the conscious mind was the positive principle, the energetic aspect that is creating, and he conceived of the subconscious as the receptive principle, or that which receives the visualizations and that which has been created down into the subconscious, again, so it can come back up and out. Now, the best thing about Neville's philosophy to me is that all this, the method of manifesting, was to bring individuals to the point of satisfaction only so that they can now fulfill their final part of their life, which is life's promise. Now, to me, the best thing about Neville's philosophy is that this teaching about the method, it doesn't just end there. All this talk about the method is ultimately to get individuals to a state where now their needs are met and now they can turn their goal oriented heavenward, so to speak. That once your needs are regularly met and now you have the opportunity to ask yourself, well, what now? You then turn back inward and begin to ask, who is it that really enjoys the rewards of this practice? Who or what am I? This is what Neville called the promise. Promise was to discover man's true nature in God. Towards the end of his life, by the end of Neville's life, he had now further refined his message to being separated into the law, which was the method. It had become less emphasized by that time. And the second half being the promise, which is the ascension of man, or man realizing his nature with God. And again, Neville is using the Bible as this allegory and metaphor for his entire system. So even the Bible itself being divided into two parts, the old part, or the law, and the New Testament, or the promise, it being divided the same way. That's how Neville saw this parallel. He saw that the New Testament did not reject the Old Testament, but it fulfilled the Old Testament. Hence, Neville's system being the same thing. The promise fulfills the law. So the law is there for people to utilize, but it isn't the end goal itself. Man has a much deeper and more important calling than just simply fulfilling one's needs. The figure of Christ himself is the image of the fulfilled man, the complete man. And he believed Christ to be the promised destiny of every human being, the end goal for everyone. He believed this to be God's ultimate plan. To slowly spiritually awaken every individual being, however long that took. This is how Neville interpreted even sayings from the church fathers who were more mystically inclined in their time, such as Saint Athanasius making the statement, God became man so that man might become God. For Neville, the fulfilled destiny of mankind is godhood itself. And it wasn't presented in some kind of exclusivist way. He was a universalist in every sense of the word. The promise is for every individual being to get to that end goal however they may do so. As a spiritual optimist, Neville truly believed that every being was ultimately going to get to that end state. Whether it's through reincarnation and cycles, everyone's destiny was this destiny. And I respect Neville so much. He was a daring individual who left comfort at the door in order to seek out truth and reality. He was bold, he was daring. The man experimented and sought truth for himself, a seeker in every sense of the word. I sympathize with his journey a lot, especially him in his early life living such a rigid, austere life, only really focusing on the outer forms of religion, ultimately then to feel empty by the end of that process, and now realize he needs to start from within, develop that spiritual reality inside of him, and work from there. Not to say that everybody's spiritual path is going to look like that, but that was mine, and that was certainly Neville's. What some of us ended up having to learn is that the ultimate truth of reality is not attained through such a tight grip. Sometimes people need to just let go to discover the truth and the reality, to focus on your inner state and your reception towards life. That's truly an ability we all have as people. But Neville continued to ask that same question throughout his life. What is that underlying reality that is continually trying to create life all around us? For Neville, each step of the way proved to shorten the divide between God and man. And again, the same can be said for those of us who've been on a very similar journey to what Neville had to endure. I really love the writings of Neville Goddard. I see him as a great model for taking the esoteric secrets of life and presenting them dynamically, clearly, and boldly in a very romantic way. He was a true artist, and you could feel that radiating from him. You can listen to his old talks. You can read his books. He's still alive, and his message is still just as vibrant. One last point that I wanted to discuss when it comes to Neville is the take that some people have in esoteric circles, but some people in esoteric or occult circles like to speak down about New Thought and the authors that came from that movement. And understandably, if you study other esoteric paths like Hermeticism, theurgic principles, or ceremonial magic, these are elaborate, eloquent systems that involve time periods and seasons and meditations and rituals. So it's understandable why they might think that this is far too simplistic. While they may have good points to make from their perspective, most people are actually not aware of the influence that Neville Goddard had on those even in ceremonial magician circles. Famous ceremonial scholar and Golden Dawn initiate was Israel Regardie, who actually wrote a chapter about Neville Goddard in his book, The Romance of Metaphysics. Regardie even recalls that he had the opportunity to go listen to Neville speak, and he actually spoke quite fondly about Neville and his method. While Regardie does comment that Neville does seem to make this method seem a lot easier of being in that end state than it really is, he can be quoted as saying, "Of all the metaphysical systems with which I am acquainted, Neville's is the most evidently magical." Regardie was indeed impressed with Neville's way of encompassing the desired outcome through use of the imagination and allowing the outer existence to form around that state. So take it with a grain of salt. People will criticize no matter what exists out there, but personally I think Neville's methods did go through scrutiny and they held up to intense scrutiny. So moving on just a little bit, if you enjoyed this talk about Neville Goddard and you'd like to read or research some more, I have a few book recommendations. I chose one from every decade of his writing career that seemed to have the next evolution state in them. The first one I recommend is Feeling is the Secret, written in 1944. The method and context is further expressed in the next recommendation, book 2, The Power of Awareness, written in 1952. And the third book is the book that we mentioned earlier in this episode, The Law and the Promise, written in 1961. Thank you for watching, Veiled Seekers. I truly appreciate it. If you've hung out this far, please like and subscribe below. Please leave a comment below. I welcome comments. I would love to get some book recommendations. If there's a topic you guys want me to get into, please feel free to write a comment and I'll check it out. If you are listening on Spotify, please subscribe. Please rate the podcast 5 stars if you enjoyed it. We will see you next time.